Good afternoon and welcome to D&I One-on-One, a bi-weekly webinar series. Each program is a conversation between me and a guest where we talk about one thing, diversity related, maybe it's culture, inclusivity, diversity, equity, belongingness, and everything in between. Today's conversation, ESG Across Generations. I'm Jina Etienne. I'm the host of this series. I'm a certified diversity executive. And I practice with something I call fearless inclusion, which is the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. I develop trainings and workshops. I facilitate conversations and programs to help my clients connect mindfulness and self-awareness to their daily actions. I've been doing this work now for almost 10 years. And as a CPA, formerly 26 years in public accounting, I bring my lived experience to this work with my clients every day. My guest today is Leah Smiley, founder and president of the Society for Diversity. Leah has 15 years of experience in diversity and inclusion and 25 plus years of experience as a master of training and organizational development. She's definitely a DEI thought leader in this industry. She's facilitated hundreds of presentations for more than 10,000 professionals and executives around the world and consulted with over 100 organizations. Her work's been featured in media like Forbes, Fortune, USA Today, and more. I don't remember where I saw this, but she was also described as a LinkedIn all-star. And I smiled when I saw that because you can always rely on her to post thought-provoking articles and share DEI trending news. So I certainly recommend following her on LinkedIn if you want to keep up with news, ideas, best practices, all that stuff. And when she isn't working, Leah is a basketball mom, traveling around, taking the kids to lessons and to coaches, going to games, and of course, paying for all of it. So Leah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about today's topic. I know that it is foremost on a lot of people's minds, and certainly I'm hoping that we can share some great information.
I'm on mute now. Before we get started, let's go ahead and launch this first poll so we can get a sense of where everyone is on the spectrum of I'm very familiar with ESG to I have no idea what this is.
Thank you, Jina. I've just launched poll question number 1. You should see that on your screens now. If you don't, please let me know in that questions box. Otherwise, I'm going to keep this open for 1 minute.
So, Leah, let me set up this conversation while they're taking the poll. I want to go back to the first time when we were talking about this in planning for the session. You were talking about the business case, next gen expectations for how you pursue the bottom line, and then the concept of doing good while making money. And everyone acknowledges the importance of ESG, but your contention is that young people, and I'll just say people younger than me and you perhaps, they have different expectations on what this means and why it's important. So, as soon as we see the results, maybe we can start by maybe defining what ESG is before we jump into the deep end.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
And results are in. So I see 30%, it's pretty even split, a third, a third, a third, somewhat familiar, vaguely familiar, all news to me. And then we have 11% that said very familiar. So there you go, Leah. It's your job to help everybody get all the way to very familiar.
Okay, well, that is exciting for me because I love to teach. And certainly I understand that there is a lot of fear and hesitancy today, and an unwillingness to kind of stand up and talk about this, as well as face some of the pushback. But the retaliation is real. And people are in a conundrum about how to deal with this issue. Currently, there is a lawsuit against the state of Missouri.
Hold on. Leah, can we step back real quick? Can you define ESG for our folks that are listening?
I am. So I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for what this is and why this is so necessary. But ESG basically is environmental, social, and governance. And it is basically a set of principles, as the screen shows, that organizations can adopt to promote a long-term approach to conducting business, doing business. The first time that we heard about ESG on a large scale was in 2004. When there was a UN report that talked about ESG, and it was endorsed by Goldman Sachs as well as Morgan Stanley. And at that time, corporations had to determine to what degree do we get involved with ESG? To what degree is the environment important to us? Is the social impact important to us? Is corporate governance important to us, right? And how does it really impact the bottom line? And this is where, fast forward, my conversation comes in for some of the lawsuits that we're seeing today by people in the financial services industry and accountants and more, basically bringing lawsuits against states such as Missouri, where you have the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association bringing a lawsuit saying that the state has overstepped its boundaries because it passed rules to curb the impact of ESG in investment decisions. You have insurance lobbyists in Texas who oppose the ban of ESG considerations, and as a result, we saw that, multiple financial services companies were banned in the state of Texas. So retaliation is real. It's important for us to really think about this conversation from a perspective of misinformation, as well as emotions and the intersectionality, right? So as we're looking at these different generational groups, how do they all intersect?
So it's interesting, folks. We were having some sound issues, so we're muting and unmuting as we talk. So it's interesting. Sorry for any awkward delays. We talk about, how does this all intersect, and the idea of intersectionality itself is something that is different between folks in. I'm going to put myself in the older generation. I'm a Gen X, not quite a boomer, and my sons. One of my sons is a millennial. The other son is a Gen Z. And they clearly see things differently than the way I see things. And I know when we were talking about this before, it's almost as if it goes without saying that ESG should be part of what companies are doing. And yet we have organizations still struggling to figure out how does it fit in their work day to day from a profitability perspective, if nothing else.
Right. But I think one of the things that you highlighted is that with your two sons that represent different generational groups, they have different perspectives. And certainly I have to think about that too. My kids are the same, in the same bucket. I have my oldest kid that is millennial, and then the last four are Generation Z. And they are what they used to call back in the day tree huggers, right? So they're like, okay, mommy, we've got to do stuff about environments. Like, what are you doing buying that styrofoam plate? We need to buy the bowls and the plates that are biodegradable, right? So they are looking at the ingredients. They are thinking about all of the things that my generation and my father's generation, my mother's generation did not think of, right? So it is, and certainly my millennial child, she's kind of talking about those things, but not to the extent that my Generation Z kids are. And this is what we need to pay attention to, because one of the things we talk about in the DEI space is how what you see in the household ultimately plays out in the workplace and in the marketplace.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's interesting because an overarching idea, certainly when I approach it with my clients when it comes to D&I, is that you have to look at what's happening in society as a whole, because that infiltrates or that sets out the framework for culture and mindset inside organizations. And so you talk about ESG across generations. I'm going to jump to this slide that has the generations. Now we have a polling question about generation size, so don't answer that part in the workplace. You can't talk about that. But when you look at the different generations here and you think, why does it make a difference? Aren't we all interested in profit and bottom line profit? So if we're all motivated by profit, then how does this differ?
We are in different ways, right? So I just want to add some perspective. So we're in what we call right now a, a time when we are, or we have been, kicking the can down the road. If you can take us to the 3 pillars of ESG slide, that would be great. The reason why I say we have been kicking the can down the road is because I remember growing up in New Jersey, right? And there were signs everywhere like, don't be a litter bug, right? So that was the extent, and just thinking about dropping something out the car window or dropping trash on the ground, especially when New Yorkers used to call New Jersey like the environmental wasteland, right? Certainly, when we think about some of the things that happened in the late 1970s to the 1980s, we had some oil spills. And during that time, there were people who said, you know what, we don't have to worry about these oil spills because the impact on the environment will not affect us during our lifetime. Right, so we saw in 1976, Argo had 7.7 million gallons of oil that spilled. 1978, we had the Amoco oil spill where 69 million gallons of oil spilled. The Exxon Valdez, some of you may remember in 1989, that oil spill had 10 million gallons, and certainly for those of us who were around during that time, we remember birds being taken out of the water with oil on their wings, and all sorts of different impacts. And certainly there were people during that time who said, hey, you know what, we don't have to worry about this. There's not going to be an impact that we have to worry about today. It's going to happen down the road, right? When we think about the social part, today there are attacks on DEI and policies in particular that impact, I'll be specific here, Black people. And the reason why is because the affirmative action decision by the Supreme Court specifically addressed only admissions for African American students in education. But there's a new lawsuit out that really attacks the entrepreneurship, the investments that these female Black-owned businesses have been receiving, and ultimately it will serve as the foundation of undue supplier diversity, and ultimately work on this diversity and employment. Now, I want you to imagine this, right? So one of the things that we have to think about as we're kicking the can down the road is that if our workplaces and if our marketplaces are becoming more technologically advanced, it will require skilled workers. And if people are concerned about diversity today, and concerned about the demographics today, what's going to happen if we make it so that Black people in particular are not able to have education, higher education, entrepreneurship, or employment in some of the high growth industries? I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to have to get skilled workers from the population centers or the population powerhouses in China, India, in African countries, South America. So again, some people say, oh, not in our lifetime. Well, as we're looking at the need for skilled workers, do we kick the can down the road and say we're going to increase the amount of diversity and accelerate culture change? Or are we going to make it so that we create avenues for full inclusion, right? Even as we're talking about governance, AT&T had lead-clad telecom cables, right? And as they had those telecom cables, they realized, hey, our business is changing.
Wait,
We're
are you
going
talking
in
about the ones that are hanging over they're called clad telephone cables? Oh,
lead-clad.
lead clad. Got it.
They have lead in them.
Search it now. Got it. Thank you.
Those telecom cables have lead. And really what happened was AT&T realized, hey, our business is changing. Our business model has shifted. We're no longer, focused on, landlines where most people have landlines. Yeah, do you have a landline? No?
Technically, we do, but we don't have it connected to a phone. So it could ring, but there's nobody that's going to answer. So I don't know if that's a yes or a no.
Well, yeah, most people don't even have that. Okay, so yeah, so we're talking about, AT&T transitioning to a cloud-based business and the wireless telephone business, and certainly being able to dominate those areas. But these telecom cables have come back at a time when we're talking about corporate governance and risk management and compliance and all these other things. And it's costing billions of dollars to remove at a time when the AT&T business has pivoted. So as we're looking at this issue of environmental, social, and governance, we can make a decision to keep kicking the can down the road, thinking, okay, not in our lifetime, or we can, instead of being reactive, we can actively manage some of these issues.
So you're saying you want us to be proactive and not reactive. I wanted to put this slide up here. You were talking about this earlier, so I just wanted to come back and touch on it because you said two things. One, about the diversity in the United States and acknowledging that, thinking about how we want to shift culture, workplace culture. Otherwise, we need to look at some other centers for talent. And then you listed countries that are outside the United States that we don't even necessarily have great relationships with from a business perspective, let alone politically. Now, if you look at this chart from right to boomers all the way to left, millennials, you'll see that the bars are getting higher and higher. Each bar represents the percentage of that generation, or in that year of birth, if you will, that how diverse that population is. And so we're seeing the population is increasingly more diverse. And so there's going to be a tipping point. We've heard a lot about the majority minority shift that's going to happen. But if you think about it in the context of generations, and then you think about what matters most to those generations, as well as there are global migration patterns that are already in play that are shifting the labor force. How does this tie back to ESG in terms of companies understanding that they have to link ESG with diversity, especially because okay, hold on. I'm not going to say it. I'm going to go ahead and ask this polling question before I give the answer away, which is this one. Let's do this polling question, Christine.
Sounds good. I've just launched poll question number 2. We'll keep this open for another 60 seconds.
Yeah, I was about to give it away. The percentage, the largest population or the largest generation in the workforce. And I think, the title ESG Across Generations, I do want us to talk about why it's different. But you know what it reminded me of earlier? You were talking about that commercial, don't be a litter bug.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember that commercial? It was a Native American man, and I don't remember the scene, but I remember it zoomed in on him and he had one tear.
Hmm.
What was that? Do you
I don't
remember?
remember.
That Coca-Cola?
I don't
I don't remember,
remember.
but I do remember being very environmentally conscious. And somehow it seems that we've lost that element. So maybe we can come back to that as well. But I see
Yes.
the answers in the poll. And guess what? They got it right. 50% said millennial, 32% Gen X, and it's actually in that order.
Yep.
All right, now
So,
that we know the answer, I can go back to the question I was going to ask you.
okay.
That is,
So go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I was going to answer the first question that you asked, and that is when you talked about those changing, the shift from minority to majority and all these different things. We're spending too much time focusing on that, right? Because at the end of the day, the numbers don't really matter when it comes to uh, things like the color of a person's skin as much as these generational numbers matter, right? So this is more important than talking about minority, majority, minority, and all those different things. Because at the end of the day, the real culture change is going to happen here with these generational groups. And again, the demographic numbers have been used to provide misinformation as well as cause people to be emotional about um, about numbers unnecessarily. Because again, we've always had a large population of people that are diverse, regardless of whether or not the numbers have been reported accurately, right? So, what do you mean, Leah? I just want you to think for a moment about the fact that we say that the Black community is 12%. 12 to 14% of the US population. That number has been there for like 40, 50, 60 years. Come on. I mean,
Well,
are we?
but Leah, we also do know that the other populations have been shifting. The Latino and Hispanic population has been growing.
Well, has it been growing? And the reason why I'm going to ask is because we forget about that little thing called the Mexican American War, where we took over large territories like California, where that had the gold, Texas that had the oil. We took over these huge territories that already had people living there, right?
Well, and then I will
So,
also add, folks didn't realize this, but how people check Hispanic, a
right,
Hispanic origin versus white, is
right,
relatively new in the census. We didn't always
right,
ask
right.
that. So, okay, to be fair, then the trends aren't necessarily
Yes,
what we
right.
might
So,
understand them to be.
right. And the way that people classify themselves has also changed. So you may have someone who considers themselves, who may be Caribbean, and they don't classify themselves as Black, right? Or someone from Nigeria, or someone from perhaps an African country. They may not classify themselves as being Black. Remember the controversy that just happened when Kevin Hart was going to, I think it was Egypt. He made the mistake of calling the people Black, and they're like, "Oh, we're gonna disinvite you, brother, because we are not Black. We may be in Africa, but don't call us Black, okay?" So we're talking about people classifying themselves differently. So you may have, I've heard of people who were African that classify themselves as being white. So we're putting too much stock into these numbers, right? Because it's a fuzzy concept. And
So you're
certainly,
saying it's not race. We need to be thinking about it generationally because the mindset is shifting as it always has. I mean, the Gen Xers, we thought differently than our parents and great parents who
right,
were the traditionalists.
right.
And we thought we were the radicals at the time. So now the millennials are the ones stirring up the trouble and the Gen Zs. But leadership in corporate America is largely boomer.
Right.
So how do you convince then this leadership to really look more closely at ESG, especially as it relates to the biggest segment of the workforce that they are trying to lead and grow and retain?
Right. So this is where it gets messy. So a lot of people they hate talking about DEI, right? But it's messy. I mean, there's nothing that's simple about it. It's just a messy little thing. You know, like having a little kid that's putting fingerprints all over your window that you just cleaned. Like when you're younger, you're like, oh yeah, I have these little kids. They can run around and do whatever. When you're older, you know, and you see the kids sit on the table, you're like, what are you doing? Get off that glass table. Do not put your fingerprints on my table. And you realize your philosophy shifts, right?
Yes.
As you get older. And in certain things, you know, if you go to a younger person's house and they have little kids, you know, the house is probably going to be a mess. When you get older, you're like, hey, clean that mess up. So your philosophy shifts. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that um, sometimes people's philosophies shift, and we're also dealing with an issue that has a definitive impact on every single operation in the organization. What do I mean? I mean, you have some older people who believe that growth is going to be slower versus if we're talking about ESG, versus younger people who may be a little bit more optimistic. You may have younger investors and younger consumers who are more willing to put money behind environmental and social goals, even if it means it being a little bit costlier. Versus someone who's older saying, hey, you know what? Whoa, I don't want to spend that extra money. It doesn't mean that the younger individuals won't change as they grow older, but it does mean right now, here's my philosophy. Even when you think about business formation, you have the B Corps, or you have people who are forming their small businesses to align with doing social good. You have marketing efforts that are being tied into the way that people think about the environment, social issues, and more, and donations. Think about um, a company like Bombas Socks. Or when you go to restaurants nowadays, fast food restaurants, they'll say, do you want to make a donation? They're giving money directly to causes. So you know that you can get a 2-for-1, right? I can purchase this good or service and donate some extra change to a cause that I care about. So back in the day, you used to have, like, you know, a YMCA corporate giving campaign where they would go on site and raise money, and then they would distribute the money to nonprofit organizations that were part of the YMCA. I mean, not YMCA, but the United Way giving campaign. And today, people are like, you know, why do we need to have United Way? So that means United Way has to change their business model so that, you know, and I know you want to ask me a question. I get on a roll sometimes.
I wanted to sort of make sure we touched on something. So you said this all the way at the beginning, but then something you just said got me thinking about this backlash. Because everything, if I agree with everything that you're saying,
Uh-huh.
then it should be safe, good, prudent, sound business decision making, because all of these things are in the interest of ensuring sustainability,
Uh-huh.
retaining and attracting top talent,
Right.
aligning the needs for profit with the needs of the marketplace. So then why is there backlash? Can you talk about that?
So backlash is driven by again those emotional responses, those buttons, the lack of concrete information right? So again, we've been working in an environment where for years we've just been kicking the can down the road. And certainly, we also are dealing with backlash that results in what I'll call retaliation. Time Magazine reported that Texas, which has a higher GDP than the country of Russia, is blocking 10 financial firms from doing business with the state because of ESG, right? So this backlash thing is real. And it's scary for a lot of organizations who, number one, don't know how to talk about it, but number two, understand the real risk, business management risk that comes along with not doing ESG well. Right. And then you also have the lack of strategies. This is a relatively new area. I mean, how many we have just started saying, hey, you know what, we've got to stop kicking the can down the road. We've got to start dealing with this. So there really isn't a whole lot of information about how to do this thing well. And with all those different challenges, we have a high level of complexity. It's messy, right? It makes it so that we are in the position of trying to navigate through a political environment that complicates this these ESG objectives, right? From a sustainability perspective, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and some people, may already know this stuff here. But from the perspective of the business impacts, ESG has real impacts. Think about the insurance industry and the fact that you may have storms that may not only cause flooding to buildings, into homes, but you may also have wildfires. You have.
I'm sorry, but I'm interrupting briefly because we have a painful example right now of what's happening in Hawaii, and there are those who don't agree on climate change. Is there a way to position this that is climate change neutral? In other words, you don't have to agree that what's happening around us is the result of climate change, but you do need to be responsive to these changes. And, we talk about this from a generational perspective. What is pushing this forward? You said it's a fairly new topic.
Mm-hmm.
Is it pushing forward because we're responding to the demands of the younger generation, or is it because the younger generation is demanding that business do something about it? Push or pull,
So I would say it's a little bit of both. And it is also a little bit of it's a little bit of the fact that people don't really know what others want. So I'm going to tie this back to communication, right? So I want to do a quick.
While you do that, I'm going to invite, we'll open the poll. People can answer the poll. We'll close the poll so that they can get their CPE, but keep on going.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little equation. I'm going to say science plus society drives sustainability and strategy, which will equal profitability, right? So we want to do.
Can you repeat that? I want to write that down.
Science plus society times strategy and sustainability equals profitability. And I want to put an emphasis on strategy, right? Because we can manage the risk. But I like to think about DEI as, making money, saving money, the business case for DEI, that is, making money, saving money, achieving organizational goals. And there has to be some kind of bottom line component associated with what we're doing, right? And part of us looking at this ESG model is saying we have to manage the risk for profitability purposes, or we can kick the can down the road and it hit us, boom, when we least expect it. Then it has a real impact, right? Think about AT&T. As they change their business model, now they have billions of dollars in expenses that they didn't plan for, right? So I want people to really be able to ask some questions, right? Like, how well have we connected business concerns to ESG issues, right? Do we know what our board, shareholders, and investors want? Have we ever devoted that time to inquiring? Have we done any kind of, poll? Have we, collected data to show here's what our people want? How do we make it so that we can take a strategy that kind of diversifies our approach and doesn't just take an all or none approach, right? Because in the past, that's how we've done things. It's either do it all one way or no way. But as we're looking at these different generations, we're going to need to say, how do we make it so that we appeal to the concerns of generation, of the baby boomers who clearly don't want to lose anything, right? They're looking at it like, we don't want to lose, right? So how do we also appeal to millennials and ultimately to Gen Z, who are a little bit more optimistic about our ability to make an impact, right? So we can take an approach, and then even how do we accommodate Gen X? I mean, people always forget about Gen X. I don't know why that is, but certainly we always forget about Gen X.
Maybe we
but
can
Gen
take a
X,
quiet generation.
but we're the ones who actually raise those little what I'll call the little the firepower, right? Gen Z, right? We're
I didn't know where you
the
were going with that. Okay.
yeah, we made those, and we're surprised, like, oh shoot, look what I did. These little kids, they're something else. But certainly the other aspect is the digital component. How do we integrate the digital components to prepare for the future that will require us to address these things?
It's interesting you say that. My husband and I were just talking the other day. We've always thought about, do we get an electric vehicle? Because the whole idea of going green. People think electric cars are good for the environment, but what we are now learning is you have to zoom out and look at this more holistically, because mining for the ingredients and for the and not ingredients. What am I talking about? The raw materials that go into creating these batteries, and then maintenance and then destruction of these batteries is also bad for the environment. So balancing all of this out without losing money, pivoting your business model to stay ahead. You're referring to AT&T. Actually, before I forget, you also had some other examples around possibly like backlash and why organizations should be thinking about it. We actually have a slide with Disney, and I'm looking at the time. It's 3:42. Time flies. Can we shift real quick to talking about Disney, because I think that's a real life example, present day, of what we mean by ESG as it relates to real world profitability and culture.
Right. So there are a lot of modern day examples that can really help us to look at this particular issue. Certainly, one of the things that I think is important to highlight about Disney is that while Disney has taken a stand, the concern that I have with Disney and all these different companies that are currently in the midst of a battle is that there's not a whole lot of support for them, right? So where are all the companies that made pledges to DEI? Why haven't their CEOs taken a stand and say, you know what, we're joining in, we're supporting, Disney, we're supporting these organizations. And this is the thing that's very, very challenging for me, because even with ESG, there are a lot of organizations that are so silent. And what we have found, even with DEI, is that there is an assumption that your silence means that you agree with what's going on. And the problem with that is you never know when you'll be next. So it's like one of those things, like if I sit here and remain silent, um, I could possibly be in the situation where it happens to me next. So I was doing a little research, and the conference board, they actually recommended that organizations take a multifaceted approach to dealing with these types of issues. Number one, you have to clarify what your strategy is. And use objective language, because again, people are emotional. They're responding to emotional. I don't want my family to be gay. I don't want my kids to be gay. That's not diversity, right? So diversity doesn't mean that we are all going to be uniform, that we're all doing the same thing. Diversity means that you can be different and I can be different, and we can coexist and work together well. That's true diversity, right? And it's inclusive of everyone, because I could be different in a myriad of ways. And certainly it doesn't mean that, I am going to do the same thing that you're doing. Right. So I think it's important for us to make that connection and to explain that first, so that when we're talking about using objective language, we can make it so that we're taking the emotion out of people's decision making, especially when we're talking about things like ESG. But we also have to tailor our communications for the different generational groups. And make it so that we are communicating better, right? That we are thinking about how to have that multi-generational appeal. And Disney ran into a lot of challenges. Disney is currently facing a lot of challenges, but I'm just talking about the one that pertains to diversity right now. But certainly, I think it's important for us to really just think about how we can make it so that we're um, thinking about DEI, ESG, and all these different things from an objective perspective, right? And communicating that well. Because ESG is a global phenomenon, it's not going away, and neither is DEI. Right. So another example that you showed on the screen was Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is one of my favorites, because there was a chief financial officer who wrote a book about Coca-Cola's ESG and sustainability efforts. And certainly one of the things that they talked about was just how the bottling company experiences a lot of waste, right? So going back to the 1980s, one of the things that we saw was that you had a lot of bottles that were thrown into the ocean, a lot of cans that were thrown into the ocean, and even today, you'll see like the little carrying packet thing that gets thrown into the water, and it entangles birds and all sorts of wildlife. So
You're talking about that mesh that they put around the six packs?
that little thing. So Coca-Cola had to begin thinking about, how do we make it so that we continue to appeal to people who are concerned about these things, while at the same time delivering great beverages. So we have to begin to think about, how do we embed our strategy appropriately, so that we're not just looking at it as separate from our business, separate from our operations. And again, this is going to not only impact not only those behaviors, but also expectations, attitudes, and needs, what I call the beans. So when you're dealing with, finance people, usually people call them bean counters, but I want you to think about beans from a different way.
You just call me and my people bean counters. People listening, we're going to ignore that. She didn't mean that.
No,
Hashtag stereotypes do not apply here, but go ahead.
I'm not politically correct, I'll say. But I want you to think differently about beans. Think about it from the perspective of behaviors, expectations, attitudes, and needs. And it
Mhm.
all ties into doing what we do differently. Because if you can anticipate where there are shifting needs and expectations, you can get ahead of the competition, but also make it so that you contain that risk. Because there's risk in not anticipating those shifting needs and expectations, right?
Mhm.
You also want to make it so that you're thinking about that in respect to your suppliers, and making it so that you're connecting the work in a way that's legally defensible. So we know that there are lawsuits currently being taken out for ESG, lawsuits for DEI, lawsuits for all sorts of stuff. Part of what we have to do from a risk management perspective is to anticipate. How do we make it so that we can prepare different scenarios for these possible lawsuits? So we can do a board, like I like to think about this from a board, like a whiteboard. We can say, okay, if A happens, then B, right? If C happens, then D. If E happens, then F, right? So we can be strategic and proactive in thinking out what are the possible scenarios
Mhm.
that could come about, right? So not just assuming that every single generation is going to be excited about your ESG efforts. That has been one of the challenges for a lot of organizations. We're like operating like, okay, everybody's going to be the same. Everybody's going to be excited about us doing ESG, and that's not true. So you want to think about this from a generational perspective. How do we make it so that we're incorporating the baby boomers, Generation Xers, millennials, and um, Generation Z going forward, and ultimately Generation Alpha?
So we don't have actually a lot of questions. Some comments have been coming in, just so you know. Like somebody said that Gen Xers were not old, we're young at heart. Okay, I appreciate that. They shared with me that the article that I was talking about was an anti-littering campaign. And what was really interesting, and I'm not saying this person was exactly right, but it made me curious that the person playing the role of the actor that was Native American might have actually been Italian. Now, I am passing along a comment from a participant, but it just got me thinking about even that falls under the category of what our millennials and what our generational differences are and how it affects profitability if we look at it just in the entertainment industry. They're on
Right.
strike right now. And you have, what's the actor? Hugh Grant? No, Hugh. Oh, what's his name? He's going to play the Oompa Loompa, an Oompa Loompa. And they use digital editing to make him look like a person of short stature. And people who are short statured are losing jobs as a result. And this is a social challenge. This is directly related to diversity and inclusion and will hit the bottom line of organizations. And so I think no matter how you slice it, and I put this slide back up here, sort of toward the end here, is if you just run your eye down all of these areas where ESG is related in business, and then you look at how would my father look at these things? How do
Right.
I view these things? How does my 28-year-old view these things? And then what's the one after the millennial, the Gen Zer view
Gen
these
Z, how does
things? And
my
I would say,
14-year-old look at these things?
yeah, and for all of us, if you just think about it from that perspective, if you look at these and have a conversation with people in your own family from different generations, solely the generational lens, it can start to become clear why identifying, discussing, and understanding ESG as a part of your business, I don't even want to say business imperative, because I struggle with the business imperative of diversity and inclusion. It's more like forget the business imperative of D&I and just think business imperative.
Right.
And bringing in diverse voices and backgrounds and experiences to that conversation. And somebody says it's Hugh Grant. Thank you. This is the best part about the participants. If you ask a question, they will answer it for you. So
Well,
we have.
So I just want to add here, one of the things that we have to do is normalize the conversations around ESG and DEI. We're not going to get it all right. And you can tell people, Leah said, we're not going to get this right. We're going to make mistakes, and mistakes are okay. It's how we learn, right? We don't want to create an environment. Like I said, I'm not politically correct. I don't like to operate in environments where I can't say what needs to be said. And we also have to create an environment that's psychologically safe,
Yeah.
but that is also allowing for people to say what needs to be said.
Yeah.
With that being said, we can't take like a standard approach, like, okay, here's what worked at my last organization, because that may not work where you are now, right? You're going to have to customize, like we always talk about with DEI, you have to customize your approach to this ESG based on what your stakeholders need and what they want. So that means you're going, depending on where you are, you're going to use best practices to make it so that you can take a customized position and develop a strategy that works. It's not going to be, like something that's like a smooth, it's going to be jagged, it's going to be messy, it's going to be ugly, right? But you got to be okay with that.
Got to do
right?
it.
You got to do it. You can't kick the can down the road. You got to be okay with things being messy, right?
Yeah.
Being ugly, being, not camera ready.
Any expectation that D&I is going to come in with a single solution just doesn't make sense when you think organizational strategy, business strategy. It's iterative.
Right.
We do a lot of ideating. We set a goal. We figure out what we think it's going to take to hit the goal, and then we promptly do it wrong and do it again and do it wrong and do it again and keep changing our mind. And so I wish we could keep talking about it. We barely have enough time. I'm going to invite, let's go ahead, Christine, and open our last poll, our fourth polling question. And while that's open, I'm just going to do a shameless plug here that this series, this is a bi-weekly webinar series. 2 weeks from now, Kimberly Stephen Tate will be joining me to talk about employee resource groups. She's helped large organizations put them together, and so really just understanding what they are and how can we leverage them to support business, because they're more than a we want people to feel good with other people that look like them in this organization kind of thing. So I would invite people. That registration page is currently being built. It should be open early next week if you want to register for that. And then in your handout, you'll also see that there is a full schedule of confirmed speakers all the way through early October. And so the topics are there if you're interested. Just it's every other Friday, so it's easy to guess the dates and the times. So Leah, as we wrap up, I think we have exactly a minute. You have a minute. Do you have a final thought you want to share before we close out?
Yes. So I just want to remind you all that, this topic is not going away. And certainly, instead of kicking the can down the road, let's think about these different generations. Let's think about how we can communicate better and appeal to the different generations. We don't have to choose all or nothing. We can actually do a little bit here for Generation Z, a little bit here for baby boomers, a little bit here for millennials, a little bit here for Generation X.
Yeah.
And again, you got to be okay with being messy. It's all right. DEI is not something that's going to be like clean and clear cut and mistake free, right? We're going to make mistakes. We're going to get it wrong.
But we got to do something.
Right.
Got to do something. Doing nothing is not an option.
Right.
Standing still is falling behind. I think that's the way I heard it put. Well, thank you, Leah, for joining me. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think, Christine, it's back to you to close us out.